We've seen trade go from $2 trillion in 1980 to $22 trillion today. We've seen the movement of people and ideas and services as well. But what's interesting in this phenomenon is as much as we talk about globalization, what we've really seen, the real engine of this movement abroad, has been regionalization.
This is Beyond the Box, integrated logistics from the inside out.
Hello, and welcome to Beyond the Box. I'm Kyra Kewick. And I'm Cecilia Larson. In this episode, we're looking at globalization, regionalization, diversification. That's a lot of shins. I know, but what it really boils down to is a shift in supply chains after years of disruption.
We've run out this list quite a few times now on the podcast. It's been a whirlwind since COVID, as anyone anywhere near a supply chain will know.
And our goal is absolutely not to cause anyone to relive their trauma, but
is this our first trigger warning?
And it might not be our last, but yes, it started with COVID, then it went to the Suez Canal blockage, then to the Panama Canal, and then back to the Red Sea.
That is one well-traveled supply chain.
That's why this is a topic that will probably resonate with most of our audience. So let's get into it.
These big, dense terms need an introduction. So opening the podcast, you heard Shannon K. O'Neill. She's a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, based in the U.S. She also wrote the book on globalization. It's called The Globalization Myth: Why Regions Matter.
She's superbly well-placed to help us explain regionalization and globalization. Take it away, Shannon.
So globalization is something we talk a lot about, especially over the last 30 and 40 years. And this is the movement of goods, of services, of money, of people, of ideas, of patents, of licenses abroad. The real engine of this movement abroad has been regionalization. And over this last 30, 40 years, what we have seen is the growth of three big trading regions: a European one, a North American one, and an Asian one. And between those three regions, nearly 90% of all trade happens. The rest of the world is just a small portion of the movement around. And what we're seeing is a solidifying of regionalization, a cementing of the regionalization of this past 30, 40 years. I mean, we look at the rest of the world here, we see, Europe today, about 2/3 of the trade stays within Europe. They make things together and they sell them to each other. In North America, about 40% of the trade happens just between these three countries of Mexico, the United States, and Canada. And when you look at Asia, where in 1980, about 30% of the trade stayed in Asia, today it's almost 60%. So they have really deepened their regionalization as they become a manufacturing powerhouse, producing 50% of all manufactured goods today.
Super interesting. Let's zoom in on Asia, specifically Southeast Asia. We spoke to retired U.S. Ambassador Brian McFeeters, Senior Vice President and Managing Director at the US-ASEAN Business Council. They represent about 170 American businesses in the region. He's based in Singapore and actually has spent more than half his diplomatic career in the Southeast Asian region.
For the uninitiated, ASEAN is the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. It has 10 member countries and is home to over 600 million people, which is more than Europe or North America. Combined, ASEAN countries have the third largest labor force after India and China.
Amazing, right? I grew up in Southeast Asia. It's a fascinating, fast-moving region. And I think it's worth Ambassador McFeeters giving us an insight into why, from a business perspective, it's such an appealing area for businesses.
ASEAN is, largely a peaceful, cooperating region where business people can come out, things done. I've worked in ASEAN off and on since 1994, and I've been one of many people that's seen tremendous level of growth here, not just even all countries, but if you look over a long enough period, say look over any 5-year period, even the period that includes COVID, these countries by and large can get back to their base growth rates of 4 or 5 and sometimes even 6% real GDP growth a year. Only India and China rival that. So this place gets a lot of attention from U.S. companies because of that. The opportunities vary country by country. I'm sitting in Singapore, which is home to many U.S. companies in their headquarters, seen as a good place to do business, very clear rules of the road, low corruption. On the other hand, it's high costs, so you have that to deal with. But from my office, I can look at the water and almost see Indonesia. Indonesia is tremendous different from Singapore. a huge population, which means potential for economic activity, but much of that population is so it'll be a long time before Indonesia as a whole approaches anything like Singapore. And the other countries, you have all the opportunities in between. We have the US-ASEAN Business Council. We have essentially all logistics, food and agricultural companies, financial service companies. All of them are looking at ASEAN as a place, not only is there growth, as I mentioned before, but compared to the rest of the world, with the exception of Myanmar, which is going through its own troubles. I always like to cite the fact that U.S. companies as a whole have an estimated $350 billion in investment in Southeast Asia. And that's surprisingly more than U.S. companies have invested in Japan, Korea, and China combined. People are surprised by that. So that's just to say U.S. companies have a strong presence here.
ASEAN, an economic powerhouse hidden in plain sight.
There are so many potential taglines. Oh, Lord, someone hold me back.
Have mercy on the listeners.
I mean, I think that they would enjoy it, but I will hold back. But I still think we should stay in the region for just a moment longer, because we actually really need to hear whether globalization is being replaced by regionalization. And we'll stick with Ambassador McFeeters here, because he has some great insights in Southeast Asia.
I think that's true to some extent for two reasons. One is there's kind of a nationalization trend here in some of the countries in Southeast Asia, where the countries, as they go up the economic ladder, are basically saying, we could do more manufacturing at home. I think they look to China and say, China basically is making everything at home. Why can't we? But then another thing that's happening is geopolitical stress or tension. A lot of governments out here refer to US-China tensions as something that's driving a wedge in what they saw as kind of rampant and unrestricted globalization a few years ago. So for two reasons, I was just in a meeting with the government of Singapore where they said, you're going to see companies having to adjust to be, less automatically global than they were before. So I think that's something that companies are coping with. On the other hand, if you look at geopolitical tensions in the world, you have Ukraine, you have the Middle East, so they're all terrible. And they affect Southeast Asia, but they don't affect it in a very large way. I mean, you can kind of look month to month in Southeast Asia and you see, exports are increasing, digital economy is growing, middle class is rising. I think there's something like a couple million, new internet users every month out here. So you kind of have this, it's not perfect by any means out here, but you have this kind of reliable economic growth out here that I think keeps it very interesting for U.S. companies.
So as you'd expect, Brian McFeeters, as a retired U.S. ambassador, has a vastly different outlook to Shannon O'Neill. This is a great time to introduce another viewpoint. We've had the academic overview, and we've had the business association.
Yeah, but what does that look like from a logistics partner's perspective? Ditlev Blicher is the president of Asia Pacific for Maersk, and here are his observations.
First thing is that I see that supply chains remain interdependent in spite of a lot of the challenges that we're hearing in the news, in spite of the geopolitical situation that we find ourselves in. I still see the supply chain essentially remain interdependent. I would say, though, that what we have seen over the last number of years is that Southeast Asia has grown in response to probably risk mitigation from supply chains that previously had full dependency on China as a market. The third component, I would say, that Asia is continuing its transformation from historically being manufacturing for developed markets overseas. Asia is in full swing becoming a large consumer market in and of itself. In fact, if you're looking at Asia as one market, it's by far the largest consumer market already. The only thing you can say about the future right now is that change is accelerating, with climate change as one aspect. Digitalization has opened a lot of opportunities over the last decade, maybe a couple of decades, but that has just been supercharged on the back of AI that is less than effectively a year old. Add to that the geopolitical challenges that are occurring. In aggregate, you can go in and say it becomes very, very difficult to predict. It also means there's a lot of opportunity. The ones that first grasp those opportunities will win in that particular market. I also think, quite specifically right now, what is driving some of this diversification out of, for instance, China, which is probably one of the macro moves that we've seen. One of those drivers was that cost in China was starting to increase. However, that has actually reverted somewhat since COVID, where China has been essentially in a deflationary situation. So all of a sudden, China has had a second coming to market, if you will, in terms of real value that China manufacturing is bringing to supply chains right now. So back to the point before about resilience and diversification, these are changes that are happening. And what we're seeing is some customers that are super agile, they are able to swing. They're able to first transition manufacturing outside of China and then swing it back in when it's to their advantage. And I think that agility is really the driver to success in the future.
It's so interesting that Ditlev Blicher notes that disruptions are becoming the norm, and that to fight this, agility and digitalization are key components.
There's also that key question still to answer here. What's the best approach for business? And how do you strike that balance of the shuns, the regionalization, the globalization, the diversification? So let's hear from Ditlev Blicher again.
The best approach, I think it calls for having agility in your supply chain. So I think many organizations or organizations that are engaging either globally or regionally are finding that you're going to have to go in and broaden your risk. So I think having a sole dependency on a singular market, is becoming quite risky. So I think spreading risk for several markets and then be agile enough to respond to any either macroeconomic challenges, a climate challenge, or even political challenges that may arise. I think you would need to have the diversification component. That means that you will spread your risk or your ability to respond to changes in the market. And I think that the digitization component, that's the speed with which you can react to it. So if you're in a fully analog supply chain, you can still adjust, but it takes a while before you figure out what's actually happening or where your inventory is, as an example. Digitizing that means that you'll be able to respond to it in a much, much faster fashion, but you will also be able to get a more comprehensive view of what your supply chain looks like. Today, there's way too much guesswork in place when we're looking at traditional supply chains. And I would say the way that we then respond to that is that we build a lot of buffer stock throughout the supply chain to react to unforeseens. Because we know that today, the reaction time could be improved upon, if you will, by applying more and more to build the digital component further.
We have a pretty comprehensive view of what's happening in Asia now, and how European and North American businesses are or could respond to current events.
But that still leaves a huge part of the world to look at. What happens in Europe and North America definitely doesn't represent what happens in other parts of the world. Fortunately, Shannon O'Neill can shed a bit of light on that too.
Right now, with this fluidity to global supply chains, it's an opportunity for countries that were really left out of the last phase of globalization. And so you look at countries in South America or in Africa or perhaps in the Middle East and other places where when they hooked into global supply chains, they were really on the ends of them. They were either shipping out commodities to China or to the United States or to Europe or other places, and then they were receiving back finished manufacturing goods. And many of these countries lost or weakened their industrial sectors. They, were victims of what economists call premature deindustrialization. So losing your manufacturing sector or big parts of it before you become a wealthy country. And so right now there's this opportunity for those countries that were left out of the benefits of the last time around to join in. There's movement around here where they could attract international companies, international capital, and technologies and the like to their countries. But if they don't hook into this now, if they don't participate in what's the movement that's happening today, then they'll probably get left out for the next round. Then they'll see slower growth. They'll see less diversified economies. They'll see less connection to the world in terms of trade and the like. Their economies will suffer, and so will their people. So this is a real opportunity, but it's one that won't last forever and that they need to take advantage of today.
That's such a fascinating point that Shannon O'Neill raises, that international trade and regionalization come in waves. So if you're not on this wave, or if you miss the boat, you can just ride the next one if you want.
Yeah, and it'll be interesting to see what that actually means for economies beyond Asia, Europe, and North America. Definitely something to keep an eye on. But for now, a quick little recap of this episode's learnings.
Right, so what we saw was regionalization is here to stay. Globalization is alive and thriving. The world has never been so interconnected, and supply chains have never been more complex. Companies are exploring ways to diversify and shore up their resilience. And while regionalization isn't present in all regions, it could be one day.
Beautiful summary. And that's it for Beyond the Box. A big thank you to our producer, Helen Hoffman, social media by Domino Koopmanshop, and audio production by Donna Shakar A.
You can find our episodes on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen.
Subscribe to make sure you don't miss out, and why not give us a review or a rating while you're there. Bye for now.